Good morning, guys. Just making sure you can hear me. Can you guys hear me? All right.
Yeah.
We'll go ahead and get started on this warm-up. You do not need to write down the document. That would be crazy. All I want you to do is try to summarize the document in your own word and explain how you could use it to argue the prompt. The prompt is above. I'm going to give about 5 minutes to do this. And the year we're going to talk about is 1954. April 27th, 1954. On April 27th, 1954, the largest vaccine trial ever began. It was for the polio vaccine, and 1.8 million children were tested for it. April 27th, 1954, the largest vaccine trial ever began. It was for the polio vaccine, and 1.8 million children were tested for it. All right, so let me just explain really quickly how vaccines work, what this was for. So polio is probably most famous because of its effect that it had on Franklin Roosevelt, but polio was becoming worse and worse, and what it does is it attacks your nervous system. It can kill you. It can also leave you paralyzed. That's what it did for FDR. It's a virus. It's no different than COVID-19. Well, I mean, it's actually incredibly different than COVID-19, but they're both viruses. So with this, there is going to be a vaccine that's going to be discovered in the early 1950s, but they didn't know if the vaccine would work or not. And they figured the only way that they could test this was through a massive sample size. So of the 1.8 million children that were tested, 900,000 of them would get the vaccine and 900,000 of them would get a placebo, meaning that they would be injected with something, but it wouldn't actually be a vaccine. It would be nothing. And this was to see, they would have a controlled group and a non-controlled group to see how the vaccine, if it had any negative effects on the children. Now, there were 3 countries that took place in this. One was Finland, the United States was another, and I cannot remember the third one. All the children that were tested in the United States were in Virginia. Basically, if you were 6 years old in 1954 and you went to public school in Virginia, you were more than likely tested with this vaccine. Why this is crazy is because they didn't actually know if the vaccine was going to do anything bad to you or not. And they tested 900,000 children with it just to see how it would work. It was like a massive science experiment. Thankfully, the vaccine worked very well. There were no negative side effects. And because of that, we have a polio vaccine today. Probably all of you have gotten your vaccines. You have to get 3 of them to be almost 100% immune. This is why if you hear about some people who are called anti-vaxxers today, they don't believe in vaccines because they think it's like bad for some reason. This is why it's not good, because a lot of times people will go get the first round of the vaccine. That will make them about 96 to 97% immune. But you have to get all 3 shots of it, which is at different periods in your life, to be about 100% immune. So this is why anti-vaxxers kind of suck, because not only are they putting their kids at risk, they're also putting other people who have potentially gotten the vaccine at risk as well. And there's some vaccines, measles is the biggest one. You could take 10 shots of the measles vaccine, you're not going to be 100% immune. You're about 97% immune from measles. All right. So that is your today in history. Vaccines. All right. So what we're going to look at first are 2 things on your paper that I noticed that can make your papers much, much better. All right. I'm going to be going through this. I would encourage you to write some of this down if this is something that you feel like is reflective on your own paper. You're going to have to kind of self-evaluate how much you think you need this versus how much you don't need this. If you have questions, please let me know. I'm going to be marking this up a little bit. to help make sure you understand what I'm talking about. But there are a couple points out there that you guys should nail at this point, and one of them is contextualization. But you need to make sure that there is one thing on contextualization a lot of you guys did, and I gave you actually credit for it on this paper, but you might not get credit for it on the AP test, which is you need to relate to the prompt or the theme of the paper at least a little bit, okay? So let me show you what I mean. So here's a bad example, all right? And when I say bad example, I mean that it could be better. World War I caused for Black people to move up to the North for jobs. Women got the right to vote. The Great Depression happened, and it caused for a lot of people to lose their jobs. The New Deal helped with the Great Depression. And then all of a sudden, bam, here's your thesis. World War II caused for national identity to change for women and Black people by receiving more jobs, but racism and nativism did not change. So you have facts from the previous era, but in no way, shape, or form do they really relate to the thesis. You want to try to have some type of way in which you're relating the prompt or the theme of the paper back to the thesis, at least a little bit. So even if it was just something like this, slightly better, and just so you understand where I'm talking about, you would take this and you would put it right here, okay? So you're taking the Great Depression. You're still not connecting it to the theme of the paper. The theme of the paper is national identity. But you are at least connecting from the Great Depression to World War II. So you would say World War II would end the Great Depression. It also caused for a lot of changes. World War II caused for national identity to change, and it would be the same thesis. All right, so you need to have at least a bridge from your contextualization to your thesis to make sure that you get credit for the point. But if you're wanting a guaranteed, make sure you get this point 100%, then this would be your perfect example. Now, it is almost the same exact number of events that you're talking about. You don't need any more historical knowledge to do the bad example from the perfect example. All you need to do is just continually relate it back to national identity. So read down here at the bottom. After World War I, the U.S. was already experiencing a lot of changes in its national identity. Women gained the right to vote, and Black people, having moved up to the North during the war, started to have freedom of expression in new ways through the Harlem Renaissance. Culture became more involved around products and consumerism, with the assembly line making mass goods faster and cheaper. The Great Depression of the 1930s caused for citizens to rely more on their government than ever before. However, the most permanent and biggest changes to national identity came with World War II, and then you would have your thesis after this. So not only do you have a bridge, this is your bridge down here, but you also are constantly relating to how culture or identity was changing. All right? Any questions about this? So Austin, what are all the sections on the AP test again? You have a DBQ and that's it. Very simple. All right, if no questions about this, then I'm gonna move on to our last thing before we get into notes, which is that documents need to use evidence from the document to explain why you're right. All right, biggest thing I can explain this to you is in this way. I need for you to assume when you are writing that the person you are writing to thinks that you're wrong, that you're actually arguing something meaningful, and that the person that you're arguing with actually cares about being right. All right. So let's use this as an example because this is a real life example right now. Should the Georgia economy be opening back up with COVID-19? So yes or no, that's your fact. And there are very, very divided sections on this right now. So let's say I had a chart for you, and this chart showed all of the tests given in the United States broken down by state, all right? What you would see is that Georgia is in the bottom 20 when it comes to testing its citizens. So a lot of you, how you would respond to this document, you would summarize the document, which the summary of the document would be Georgia is the bottom 20 when it comes to testing its citizens, so it should not open back up. Why is this a bad example? It's a bad example because you haven't explained why you're right. You're just stating facts. But let's say the person that you're arguing with is personal, like trying to be a troll. They're trying to get you off topic. They're trying to just prove that you're wrong. Imagine you're arguing with some of these crazy people who are out there right now, like yelling at nurses doing silent protest. If you said Georgia's in the bottom 20 when it comes to testing, all they're going to say is, so what? Georgia also has the third lowest number of rats in the state. We have a very low rat population. Does that mean that COVID-19 is all of a sudden more of a danger towards Georgians than other people? You have to explain why Georgia being in the bottom 20 is actually bad for COVID-19. So this would be your good example. Georgia is in the bottom 20 when it comes to testing its citizens. Because of this, people cannot accurately assess if they have the virus or not, and therefore may be spreading it unknowingly to people who, if they get it, could die or get really sick. Because of this, Georgia should not open back up. You're using the same exact summary, but now you're also explaining to your dumb audience, the audience that you are arguing with, why you are right. That is the thing that some people are missing in their papers. All right. Any questions about this? Maria, I'll answer that question in just a second. All right, now taking this to the actual paper, let's talk about document B, because almost all of you use document B, and a lot of people use document B incorrectly. Document B was Executive Order 9066. So this was the document where Franklin Roosevelt was putting Japanese people into internment camps. All right. So this is a bad example. This is what some of you guys do. It's where you don't even summarize the document. All you do is you reference the topic or the theme of the document. Don't do this anymore. All right, you will not get credit for this on the AP test. As seen, this is an actual example from someone's paper. As seen in document B, due to World War II, hatred and harm towards other countries was strengthened. It doesn't explain how hatred or harm towards other countries was strengthened. It doesn't explain that this is internment camps. This is just a pure reference of a document. Don't do this anymore, okay? So a good example of this would have your summary, and then it would have your explanation. So document B is President FDR giving Executive Order 9066. This order made it to where all Japanese Americans had to go live in isolated desert camps. Now, again, you're trying to argue that national identity is changing. So how does this show national identity is changing? That's the part in red. This shows that the U.S. is restricting Japanese American rights in an unconstitutional way, and that the national identity is changing to have the federal government that can change people's rights. Okay. Now, one just very helpful thing that some of you guys should really embrace are topic sentences. So a topic sentence would just be, I'm going to explain this. Here's how I'm going to explain it. One of the ways that national identity was changing was by having a powerful national government take away people's rights. Then you would use the document to give your summary, and then you would explain how your summary explains your topic sentence. All right. This is good. What I'm about to show people, if you are wanting to make a 4 or a 5 on the AP test, which there are several of you that can do this, but it has to be self-identified. The difference between making a 5 on the AP test and making a 4 is a pretty big gap. The difference between making a 4 and a 3 is a pretty big gap. So I'm going to show people just really quickly what a 5 would look like, how you would argue your documents. I do not want this to freak people out. If you understand this part and this is all you want to do, you can do this part right here and you will get probably a 2 or a 3 on the AP test. But if you are somebody and you know who you are because you're going to read through this last example that I'm about to give, and you're going to realize, oh, I can actually do this, then this is how you should be arguing. Not with every single document, but at least with 1 to 2. So this is what a 5 would look like. One of the ways that national identity was changing was by having a powerful national government take people's rights away. Document B is President FDR giving Executive Order 9066. This made it to where all Japanese Americans had to go live in isolated desert camps. Notice the white is the same exact thing. All right. You have a topic sentence and you have your summary. The red, this is where it changes. This changed the U.S. national identity with a complete overreach of federal power by the federal government. Previously, the federal government had targeted immigrants with restrictions like the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Quota Acts of the 1920s, but those were targeting people in the country. This was targeting American citizens. The only thing close to this being done was Lincoln suspending habeas corpus and throwing Confederate supporters in jail. But this was even a greater offense than that because these Americans had done nothing wrong. They were American citizens and targeted exclusively for their ethnicity. This completely changed the power dynamic between liberty and what the Constitution allowed for the federal government to do. All right, so what I'm doing is I'm taking previous events that we've already talked about and explaining why that is different than this event to prove your point. All right, it's a massive history flex. It's saying basically, not only do I know about this event, but I know about other events related to it. Do note that this could also count as your counterclaim. If you do this a couple of different times through your paper and you're trying to get a 5, you could do this instead of a counterclaim. That's where you would make up the time. You wouldn't have to do a counterclaim. Instead, you would just have a bunch of different events that you're kind of comparing to or using to explain your nuance in that way. All right. Any questions about this? Rosie, that wouldn't give you the outside information point because these are from previous events and you would need to use the outside information to prove your thesis. So how national identity did or did not change. So you'd want to have a separate event, and I'm actually going to talk about outside information next time. So if you're wondering like why this would look different than outside information, I'll explain that next time on Wednesday. Any other questions? Marie Jose, is the AP test going to affect your grade? It won't, except for you have to just turn in that AP review packet. So that will affect your grade, but it will not affect your grade. And like if you take it and you don't do good on it, it's not going to hurt your grade in this class. Again, I'd recommend everyone take the AP test. All right. Any other questions before we get into notes on contextualization or documents? To use 2 historical examples, not so much. I think that as long as you were consistently kind of like relating to other periods like this, you would be fine. I don't think there's a set number. Rosie, I sent, and to everybody else, I sent feedback back to everybody on Friday. So whatever email you used to turn in the paper, I sent feedback to that email. And I got about 20 emails that were kicked back, probably meaning that it's not an active email. You just sent it through your APS Gmail account, which doesn't actually have email on it. And so if you want your feedback and you didn't receive it, just email me through Submit Murray and I'll still send you your feedback. AP review packet, Lonnie, is about 10% of the grade for this semester. All right. Now, one more thing, you guys are able to earn points back on your test 2. How you do that is you go on My AP, you'll see test 2 additional points. You'll have 1 week to do it. It's going to be assigned tomorrow, actually, so don't go rush and do it today. It will be assigned tomorrow. I have some students who have had technical difficulties, and so they're still allowed to take the test up until today. But you'll have 1 week to do it, so it will be due next, I guess, Tuesday. Each question you get right, you'll get half a point back. You cannot make higher than a 75 on the test. So if you made higher than a 75, don't bother doing this. There will be 30 multiple choice questions. So if you get every one of them right, you'll get up to 15 points back. And there is no time limit on this. So you can take as long as you need to on this makeup test. Okay. Any questions about that? No? All right. So then the last thing, let's just look at for May 1st. We're on this week right here, April 27th to May 1st. What you guys have due this week, it's a light week when it comes to assessments. I want you guys to get caught up on these period reviews. So there is no assessments for right now, really this week, just period 4. But again, that's not actually due on Friday. Do not use this time. Don't think that you have this week off. I'm trying to give you time to get caught up, not to get further behind. So the period 4 stuff will be posted today. I haven't posted it yet, but it'll be posted today. So you can start to work on period 4. Remember, the flashcard stuff has changed. You just need to do the question outlines. If you're confused about that, go back and look at Monday's lecture from last week. I talk about it in there, or you can email me and I'll explain it in more detail. Do notice that next week, I may cancel quiz 17 and instead just make it a test. And that is ultimately to help people's grade. I think it would help more if I made it a test as opposed to quiz 17. But still thinking through that, I'll let you know that on Wednesday. All right. So let's go ahead now and get into notes. Our notes are short today, but very interesting. We get to talk about a very interesting event, which is Watergate. And the title of your notes is Nixon and Carter, Social Issues. Nixon and Carter, Social Issues. And to get into this, now I'm going to be honest, we're not going to really talk about any of Carter's social issues. Nixon really dominated that sphere. And to talk about it first, we're going to talk about a very unique situation that took place in the United States, which was Nixon's economic problems. Nixon actually had a massive recession in his first term as president. This was pretty strange because he won re-election even though this took place. So what happened is what's known as stagflation, which is a form of inflation. Now, inflation usually happens. That means that the dollar becomes less and less valuable each year. And that happens when we go into like the economy is doing well. And the way you can think about it is when the economy is doing well, everyone's making money. Since everyone's making money, the dollar becomes a little less valuable. Well, when the economy slows down, inflation is also supposed to slow down. But what was so weird about this was that the economy slowed down and inflation increased. So people are making less money and goods are starting to cost more and more. It was a bad situation. Now, you only need to know about this mainly because this is the only time in American history that this is going to take place. This is an economic anomaly. It's not ever really supposed to happen. And the only reason why this happened was because in 1970, the US went off what's called the gold standard. Now, you don't actually need to know this for your notes, but if you're really interested in like how money works, this is pretty interesting. So up until 1970, people could take their money to a bank and that dollar bill that you had was actually worth a certain percentage in gold. Because of that, the United States needed to actually have as much gold as possible so that theoretically, if you took $3 billion in cash, they would have $3 billion in gold to back it up. Well, eventually we had to create so many dollars that we didn't have enough gold to cover all the dollars. And so what we did is we went off the gold standard. So today, paper money is only valuable because we say it's valuable. It's not actually backed by anything real, which is crazy when you think about it. But when we went off the gold standard, the stagflation happened. Anyone still need this slide? So then let's get into what Nixon's really known for, which is the Watergate scandal. All right. So Nixon, I will always argue this, mainly just for fun, but Nixon was a very, very good politician. He knew how to get people to do things they did not want to do. He knew how to manipulate people. The problem was Nixon was paranoid and he was crazy. So how is Nixon paranoid and crazy? Well, Nixon ran for re-election and he destroyed his opponent in re-election. In doing that, he did not really need any help to win. Now, just so you know, Nixon was a Republican. His opponent was a Democrat. It would be like me fighting Muhammad Ali or Mike Tyson at the prime of their fighting career. Actually, you know what? Muhammad Ali or Mike Tyson, well, Muhammad Ali's dead, so he probably couldn't beat me up anymore. But Mike Tyson could still take me down. So it would be like me fighting Mike Tyson today. Tyson does not need help to beat me. He can just do that through natural ability. That was Nixon. Nixon didn't really need help to beat him, but he was so paranoid that the Democrats had something on him, that he had people break into the Democrats' national office to get information. Now, the office building that they broke into was part of the Watergate complex. That was what the complex was called. This is where the scandal gets its name. Now, these guys were horrible criminals. First thing they did, when they broke in, they kept all of the lights off in the office that they broke into. This office had a massive glass wall. It was a glassy building. So imagine you're looking up at this big glassy building. All the lights are off, and what you just see in the dark are a bunch of flashlights moving around. It looks like somebody's breaking in. Why don't you just turn on the lights? If you just turn on the lights, it's not going to look that suspicious. It's just going to be like, oh, that person's working really late. Savannah, you have a question? No? All right. So a security guard goes upstairs to check out things. When he goes upstairs, he notices that there is a piece of tape over a door handle so that the door wouldn't actually close. It's over like the little inner outer part. I don't know how to describe it. So they put tape over that thing so it can't actually close. The security guard comes by, takes the piece of tape off, and then continues to search the building. The first time they had done that, the guys hid. When the security guard comes by again, he notices that there's another piece of tape on the same door that he had already taken the previous piece of tape off of. So now he knows something's up. He calls the real police because I think he was just a security guard. The real police show up, and there are 6 people who are arrested. Very quickly, it becomes related that these guys are connected to Nixon in some way. Now, why Nixon actually was going to be impeached was because one, he was doing a bunch of illegal wiretaps and stuff like that in this, but it was also because he tried to sabotage this investigation. The major way that he tried to sabotage this investigation was by keeping these guys quiet. He wanted to pay them money to stay quiet. And the way that we figured this out was because Nixon actually had the White House bugged himself. So he recorded all of his own conversations. He did this because he was terrified that people would come back and say something about him that he didn't actually say, and he wanted to have proof that people didn't say it. Well, this video or this recording also caught him recording this entire scheme of breaking into the White House, paying these guys off to stay quiet. So they had the concrete proof they needed to prove that Nixon had done this. So Congress is going to impeach him. He was going to go to jail for federal crimes, illegal wiretapping and abuse of power. Instead, Nixon decided to resign. And when Gerald Ford became president, Gerald Ford was Nixon's vice president. When Ford became president, he pardoned Richard Nixon. So now Nixon can't go to jail because of this pardon. And because of that, everyone hates Gerald Ford, and we don't have a slide about Gerald Ford because of this. He was not reelected. Now, if you're wondering, well, what's the difference between like what's going on with Nixon and what happened with Trump? So the difference between Nixon and Trump is for Trump, they never had a concrete audio recording of Trump saying that he was going to hold this money back from Ukraine in exchange for an investigation on Joe Biden. There's other people that we have recordings of saying that and saying that Trump told them that, but they don't have Trump actually on audio itself. All right, anyone still need this slide? No? All right. So what is the fallout from this? Well, first thing, this picture, this is Gerald Ford. Because Ford doesn't get his actual own slide, it's just good to know what he looks like because he was a president for a very short time. One interesting fact about Gerald Ford before I moved on, he is the only president that was never on a ballot. He was actually Speaker of the House. Before Nixon retired or resigned, he had fired his vice president. His vice president had actually been involved in a separate scandal, completely separate from Watergate. His vice president hadn't paid his federal taxes for a while. That's kind of a big deal when you run for president of the United States. So when the vice president is fired or resigns or if they're killed, then the Speaker of the House becomes the vice president. So he became the vice president, and then a couple of months later, Nixon resigns, he becomes president. So the big bad thing about Watergate is that we are in our current political state still to this day. No one really trusts politicians, which is a pretty big deal. Like, we should probably try to trust politicians, but the thing is, they're all kind of corrupt. And that's how politics are seen today. That starts with Watergate, and it's just continued on today to where people's trust in the US government is at a very, very, very low point. The good is that checks and balances work. If we need to, we can impeach a president. This has become more questioned recently with President Trump's impeachment trial, but there is historical precedent that we can actually impeach somebody. The last thing is that the media can show the abuses of power. One thing I should note about Watergate, the way that we found out so much of this information was through the Washington Post. The Washington Post had a source who was giving them all this secret information about how Nixon operated, including these secret tapes. If the Washington Post didn't have this source and didn't publicly write about it, Nixon probably would have still stayed in power, even though he did something wrong. Now, I will just tell you the source's name because it could potentially come up later on in history, but it is kind of a humorous name today because it has a big sexual innuendo. But the source's name was Deep Throat. I will let you guys know that 99% of the time, I really wish that I was in class teaching you. Every now and then there's a moment where I'm like, well, at least I don't have to deal with this awkwardness in person anymore. Talking about Deep Throat when I first had to explain their name is one of those things. It's especially cringy, I'll say, when there's one person in the class who doesn't understand the humor in it, and then someone else has to tell them, usually very loud, across the room, is how that happens. All right, does anyone else still need this slide? All right. Olivia, just let me know when you're good. Okay. Anyone else still need it? All right. Last slide. Short notes today. That is the 1973 oil embargo. So Middle Eastern countries at this point had figured out that they all had oil deep under their sand and that this oil made them very, very rich. So these Middle Eastern countries formed a coalition or a group called OPEC. OPEC still exists today. It's called Oil Petroleum Exporting Countries. They control a majority of the world's supply in oil. Together, they set the price for how much they are going to charge for oil. They sell oil by the barrel, and so it's to not undercut one another. The most powerful of these countries, because they have the most oil, is Saudi Arabia. In 1973, Israel went to war with Arab nations because, of course, they did. This just happens sometimes, as is tradition. About every 6 years, Israel would go to war with Arab nations, and the United States would support Israel. That made all the Arab nations mad. And so they all agreed to not sell gas to the United States. At this point, the United States was buying more oil than any other country on earth. This caused for a big shortage in supply, and because of that, gas prices skyrocketed. This caused for the United States to realize that they relied way too much on foreign oil, and they started to look at other ways that they could tap into oil. today the United States actually produces more oil than any individual country, or more energy than any individual country on Earth. We actually have more energy exporting than any other country. Now, you guys may have noticed that oil has gone down in price a lot. I bought gasoline yesterday for $1.20, which I don't think I've bought gasoline for that short in a very long time. And there's a reason for why that's actually happening. The reason why that's happening is because Russia, which is kind of a part of OPEC, they have oil fields in Russia. They were having a massive argument with OPEC on how much to sell oil for. Russia wanted to sell it for cheaper than what OPEC wanted to. So Saudi Arabia, which is known to do this, decided to make it to where Russia's oil actually would be worth less by just flooding the market with oil. Saudi Arabia has so much oil that they just started to produce way more oil than there was supply to drop down the price of the oil so that everyone would buy Saudi Arabia oil and no one would buy Russian oil. It's kind of like you're either going to do what you tell us to or no one's going to buy your oil. So that happened in February. At the same exact time that happened, people began to buy, or COVID-19 started to happen that same exact time. So now people aren't driving anywhere. So the demand for oil has gone down as the supply has artificially gone up. And this has made for oil to go down in crazy, crazy low numbers. And last week, something that took place that was kind of unique was that oil actually went for $. So how this works is oil is bought on contracts. It's bought the month ahead. So all the May contracts went out last week. And there were so many people who didn't need the oil that eventually the oil companies actually had to pay people to take their barrel of oil. And the lowest price it got to was -$46. You can store oil for a very long time. So if you wanted to, you could have bought oil last week for cheap. You probably could have been paid if you had the contact to be able to buy oil for $- a barrel. The problem is you don't have anyone to sell that to right now. So you would probably just have a barrel of oil at your house. But that's what's going on with oil right now. I bought oil stock last week thinking I was smart, and it has been a very dumb move so far. Turns out last week was not the bottom for oil. But anyway, that is notes. You guys have a good day. Be on the lookout for period 4 stuff. It will be on my website this afternoon. I will probably post a link to it on the Instagram and through Remind. Those 7 points will be added to the essay. And for those of you guys who are trying to get additional points back on the test, that will be posted tomorrow. All right. If you have any questions for me, please let me know. I'm going to stop the recording.